Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist platform that we ran on in 2020. And today we have a guest right back from Europe. It's Tanya Vyhovsky, who is a member of the Vermont State Senate, a member of the Vermont Progressive Party, and a member of Democratic Socialists of America. And by trade, she's a clinical social worker, and she served in various offices of the Vermont chapter of the National Association of Social Workers. She's Ukrainian-American and just returned from a Ukraine Solidarity Conference in Brussels and other meetings with people in the UK and European parliaments. And so I wanted Tanya to come on and tell us what they're doing in Europe and what we should be doing in the U.S. So at the introduction, you just came from a demonstration, the hands-off demonstration in Montpelier, Vermont. Before we get into what you saw in Europe, what did you see today in Montpelier?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did just come in. I'm actually at the State House still from, one of the, I believe there were 12 protests across Vermont, and as you know, 1,500 or more across the country, one in, every state. And there were a few thousand, probably I'd say 2,000 to 3,000 people here at the State House. And I'm told that I've heard from people who were at protests in Brattleboro and protests in Burlington, where there were also thousands of people but stepping up, really, really loudly standing up and demanding that we protect democracy and we protect people, and that we once and for all move our economy to an economy that puts people and planet over profit. For the first time since I've been involved in politics, I heard more mainstream Democrats saying, we have to invest in people. So it was heartening to see people, all across Vermont, all across the country, and really all across the world stepping up, standing up, and fighting for people and planet.
Well, I hope people listening, if they weren't there already, if they can go later, go to one of these hands-off demonstrations. I mean, it's hands-off everything from us ourselves. So we got a government of body snatchers, grabbing people off the street to deport. And so far it's been immigrants and people here on visas, but it could be us. I mean, I'm traveling to Papua New Guinea in Australia starting Tuesday, and I'm a little worried about even getting out of the country and then grabbing my, devices and going through them and making me miss my plane and then getting back in. And then we just had the tariffs. One calculation, it's about $1 trillion tariff wall, which comes to $7,000 per person. So this is going to affect us all. There's so many reasons to go out and show your displeasure with what's going on. So I hope people will do that if they haven't already today. So let's go to, what you saw in Europe. I mean, you were at this conference organized by the European Network in Solidarity with Ukraine and Against War. That was in Brussels. Why don't you start there? What you spoke there, I guess, twice on 2 panels. So how did that go?
I mean, I think it went pretty well. It was well attended from people all over Europe, and there were, Canadians and Americans present. There was an online ability to participate. So while I was the only person from the United States on the ground in Belgium, I believe we had 18 or 19, don't quote me on that number, I'd have to go look it up in the list, people from the United States that at some point during the program tuned in. And it was heartening, again, to see people, coming together from all over to talk about the gravity of the situation. That was one of the things that I felt in Europe that I have felt somewhat lacking in the first few months of this authoritarian, presidency here in the United States. I haven't felt in a lot of spaces in the United States the gravity of what we're looking at. We had very frank conversations in Europe about the rise in global fascism, the rise in global authoritarianism, and the US's, role in that. there was a lot of conversation about this global agenda being led by Putin and being led by Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and the importance of Europe and the UK stepping up for Ukraine, and in the bigger picture, in building international working class solidarity. You know, the fascists and the oligarchs, they are connected all around the globe. And yes, they very well may hate each other. And if it is no longer convenient, they may stop associating with each other, but they are connected to each other. And I think that we had I know I certainly talked about this, and we had a lot of conversation about the importance of the working class being in solidarity and connected around the globe as well, you know, and not allowing Putin to take over Ukraine and not allowing Donald Trump to take over Ukraine. Ukraine has a right to sovereignty and a right to self-determination and a right to build the leftist movement that is building and growing. And so that was a lot of the conversation, but it was dark, and it was, you know, the stakes are high. People are afraid, rightfully so. And I think in Europe, there's, I think, one, proximity to what's happening, but also I think a better understanding of the larger implications. You know, there is not an American alive who has experienced themselves or has a relative alive that has experienced a war on US soil. And that's just not true in Europe. The buildings still bear the scars of the last World War. And, you know, I think there's just a deeper understanding of what the stakes are. But today I'm starting to see a growing understanding in the United States as well. And that, you know, again, one of the things that really showed to me from the protests today is people are starting to get it. The stakes are high and we have to fight back.
Yeah, when I was in Ukraine in November, and then further west in Europe, and also in Georgia before I got to Ukraine, the rise of the far right in Europe and the fear of Trump seemed to be much more in the minds than Americans.
Yes.
And when I was in Ukraine when Trump got elected, and the left in Ukraine was shocked and disappointed and said, this is a huge victory for Putin because it's the far right in Europe. And you're also right, you know, like when I talk to Greens compared to the Greens in the US are kind of like the International Committee of DSA. They are not in solidarity with Ukraine. And they think, you know, the US started this war. And, you know, people there would say, you know, they don't understand that this is the biggest war in Europe since Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. And the American left, you know, a lot of it just doesn't seem to feel that. You know, like you said, you know, they're closer to it, but we should understand. So anyway, is there anything more from the conference, any points that people were making? I know, well, maybe I can bring up one issue. You know, Europe is talking about rearmament. And I know the left, including this conference, was really the left solidarity people in Ukraine. The left Europeans in solidarity with Ukraine. You know, they were debating what does European rearmament mean? And we can put in the chat, it was a presentation at the conference by Simon Pirani, who considers that. But what was that discussion like there?
So I don't know that I went to that particular panel. So my attendance on that first day, part of my attendance was at the European Network in Solidarity with Ukraine, and part of my day was spent at EU Parliament. And so there were some pieces that I missed, but there seems to be a debate ongoing about what does that look like. And, you know, I certainly understand, with the United States proving not to be a reliable ally and with a war actively ongoing, you know, the conversation that's happening. And I don't think it is my place as someone who lives in the United States to tell Europeans what's right for Europeans. But it is certainly an active and important conversation that is happening as to what does that look like and how do we move towards security for Europe, but also away from constant war. Yeah,
if people look at Simon's article, the left in Europe is saying, yeah, we maybe need more conventional arms, but don't put it into things like in the UK, the Trident submarine, which has nothing to do with the kind of conflict they may have with Russia in Ukraine or elsewhere in Europe. So that it depends on what arms you're talking about. And also, don't cut social benefits, healthcare, education, and unemployment insurance, and those things to rearm. If you need more money, tax the rich and borrow it if you have to. Don't, going on an austerity binge. So that's the big debate in Europe as I see it.
Absolutely. And we did have a lot of conversations about that particular aspect, the austerity and how this is being framed as either social programs for people who need it or, Ukrainian sovereignty and a protected Europe. And we talked at every panel, on every conversation, in every space that I was, about the need in this moment in time to tax the wealthy.
So tell us about the meeting in the European Parliament.
Yeah, so that was hosted by the EU Left, and we heard from multiple different people in multiple different sectors in Ukraine about the vision for, a left Ukraine and what type of reconstruction is possible, and had discussion and conversation about what that would look like, from thinking about stronger trade unions and thinking about expansion of healthcare services and the need, post-war for an increase in social spending to make sure that Ukraine is able to build back a stronger, more left, more people-centered economy and government.
So when you say the EU left, there was a split in the left party in the European Parliament, with the side that was much stronger on Ukraine and more ecologically oriented, forming now as the European Left Alliance for the People and the Planet.
Yes.
Did those differences come out in this meeting?
I didn't hear those differences come out in this meeting, although this meeting was very focused on support for, this movement and leftist reconstruction in Ukraine. So I wouldn't imagine that the people who came to it would be sort of less supportive. But there was absolutely conversation about the importance in investing in green infrastructure and green energy, and again, rebuilding back so all too frequently. I mean, I had this great hope during COVID that, we were investing in universal school meals, and we saw emissions go down, that we would take the lesson away and rebuild from COVID a better economy. And we did not do that. We, in fact, have gone in the opposite direction. And so I think it's really important that now those conversations are happening to plan for how to rebuild and how to reconstruct in a way that is intentional and thoughtful and grounded in people and planet.
And you also met with members of Parliament in the UK.
Yes.
So were there any Greens there? I know the Greens have been very strong in Ukraine solidarity. Caroline Lucas, who recently retired, really led the charge in the Parliament for debt cancellation of Ukraine's illegitimate and unjust foreign debts. But she's moved on, and I know the party as a whole is, supportive of Ukraine, but I haven't seen any of them, sort of at the head of things like Caroline Lucas was. So anyway, tell us about that meeting, and if there were Greens there, tell us what they said.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a couple of different things that I did while I was in London. I went to London to speak at a public event with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign at Parliament. And that was a panel event with myself and Mick. He's a Welsh MP who's also of Ukrainian heritage. I would have to go look at the list of people. And then there was the former shadow minister, Ian whose last name I'm also going to forget. It's so hard to keep everything straight. I literally met probably hundreds of people. But we also had some folks from Ukraine who landed that evening, and they work with Save Ukraine. They're working with the kidnapped Russian children, or the kidnapped Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped by Russia. And we actually even heard, a young woman tell her experience of being one of those kids. And again, the message and Europe and what needs to happen in the UK to stand in solidarity with Ukraine and to fill the void. So I spent a lot of time talking, just laying the framework of what is happening in the United States. And we heard what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. And, everyone I spoke to was very supportive. The MPs and the lords that I met with were Labor Party. I didn't speak to anyone that I am aware of that identified themselves as a Green Party member or MP. That was a public event with more than 250 people there to hear us speak. So it's possible that there were Greens there, but I don't know. And then I met with labor unions. So I was doing, I went to some strikes. I went to some protests, including a Tax the Wealthy protest in London. That was originally, so I was there Monday. I met union leaders and MPs. And Tuesday was originally offered to me as sort of a free day to explore London, but I instead asked to meet with additional members of the labor movement. And, that's when I met Lord Peter Hain, and we discussed the situation in Ukraine and the situation that's going on here. MP John McDonald and I talked about, again, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in Ukraine. And then it was, again, going on out to meet like the rank and file members of the labor movement to just get a sense of what's happening in London, where they're leaning into neoliberal austerity policy. And one of the messages that I had both, in that public meeting and also in interviews that I gave at the Tax the Wealthy protest is the United States should be a cautionary tale. Nobody should be emulating what we have done to privatize public goods.
Yeah, well, between Reagan and Thatcher, this has been going on for a long time. And it's sad that in this country, the Democratic Party, and in Britain, the Labour Party have basically bought into that stuff. Yeah, I have to say, when I was there with the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign in London, and by this time it was December, I went to one of their meetings where they were reporting back from some of their people going to Ukraine. I actually ran into them when I was in Ukraine. And then right after that meeting, we marched over to a demonstration of Hong Kong trade unionists outside the Chinese embassy, which was very lively. And they asked me to say a few words, and all I could, think of was to invoke what Martin Luther King used to say about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yeah. Kind of a generic speech. And then the next thing they had me go to was a meeting of people near one of the big, rail stations, subway stations, was Standing Together, which are Israeli and Arab Palestinian people working together for some kind of justice in Israel. So they are, very well connected to the kind of solidarity going on. And 2 weeks ago, we had on this program the trade union liaison for the Green Party in Britain, Matthew Hull, who, talked about the difficulties they're having with, the Labor government pushing austerity. And, that's why the Greens are trying to provide an alternative, but also the difficulties of the Green Party linking up with the trade unions who are, tied very closely to the Labor Party, like in this country, the unions with the Democratic Party. So, here, people like me can get local union endorsements if I run for office as a Green, but at the national level, it's pretty hard. So you got to build that from below.
Absolutely. No, and we certainly, I talk to people about exactly what you're talking about, and, the frustration over the Labor Party and not and leaning into neoliberal policy. It's, the sense from people that I talk to is that if the Labor Party doesn't lean to the left, they're going to lose. And it's the same thing we're seeing here, and I'm seeing it even after Trump's electoral win, like right here in Vermont. I'm seeing Democrats with the instinct to lean to the right. And 50 years of leaning to the right means that 2025 Democrats are to the right on economic policy of Ronald Reagan. Like, there is no left movement party here that has the national capacity. Exactly what you're talking about. That I can get elected here as a progressive, and I get union support in Vermont, and we've got Bernie as an independent, but that movement to the right has created this void that I think is really important to organize. And I don't know if we can do it quickly enough, but I sure hope we can.
Yeah, that's something I preach on this podcast all the time, that we don't have a national formation capable of doing that. And I include the Green Party. But we all, wherever we are, in whatever local form we express our independent politics, can strengthen our local parties at this point, so that maybe coming out of the Trump administration, we'll have a movement that can come together and have national influence. And I think, what that means is we got to get a caucus in the House. I mean, right now we got basically Bernie as sort of a one-man nominal independent in the Senate, and, half a dozen people in the squad, but they're Democrats, and they kind of, their opposition to what the mainstream Democratic Party wants is kind of obfuscated by the fact that they're in the Democratic Party. So we got a real dilemma there. Why don't we segue from that into, your thoughts on what we need to do in this country with respect to Ukraine solidarity? I'll just, raise one point that you already mentioned. Those children that have been kidnapped by Russia. There's a program at Yale. They've documented 35,000 of these children. And the Trump administration is pulling funding from that program. For a while, it looked like they might have erased all the data. But now it looks like, they've got 6 weeks to get that data over to the Ukrainians and the European, criminal prosecutors, and then they're shut down. And that's what we're dealing with here. So what are your thoughts on, how we build Ukraine solidarity under Trump?
Yeah, I mean, well, one thing I will say is there's a Ukrainian lobby day in DC beginning tomorrow. It's April 6th through April 9th, where people are going to lobby their congresspeople. And I mean, you know, as well as I do, probably better than I do, never in my lifetime history have people in positions of power done the right thing simply because it was the right thing. They did it because it became politically untenable not to. And so I think the American people, who are still largely supportive and in solidarity with Ukraine, need to make it politically untenable for the people that are representing them in DC to continue down this path. It was not that long ago that many Republicans were supportive of Ukraine and critical of Russia. And those people need to be lobbied and pushed on and made so politically uncomfortable that they stand up. We need Republicans to stand up for what is right. And I think the people are how we make that happen. Hearkening back to civil rights, the person who signed the Civil Rights Act was a segregationist. He didn't stop being a segregationist. He signed the Civil Rights Act because the people made it politically impossible for him not to. And that's what I think the people need to do is make it politically impossible for this to continue. We need this can't be a red issue or a blue issue. It has to be a moral issue, and we need to pressure people to stand up for what's right.
I think that's really important. Moral issue. I mean, sometimes we underestimate how much people are willing to act politically for what's right. Like take the civil rights movement that pressured Johnson into signing those bills. A lot of white people around the country realized this was the morally righteous thing to do. Yeah. And that gave the movement a lot of energy. I think one mistake the Democrats have made in analyzing why they lost in 2024 was, they didn't go enough to the economic issues, which is true. I mean, Harris didn't feel people's pain, and Trump pretended to, and people bought his con job. But also, the Republicans got a story that is, it appeals to people's resentments and fears. And the Democrats don't have a counter story about, what a good society is and why, what they're advocating is righteous. And so I'm just saying you got to speak to people's material interests, but you also got to appeal to them morally. And you look at movements, anti-Vietnam War movement, civil rights movement, and other movements around the country and around the world, the moral side is really important. For people, the lobby day this weekend is organized by the American Coalition on Ukraine. If you want to Google that and see what they're doing. And you mentioned the American people. There was a Gallup poll out March 15th. This was after the ambush of Zelensky in the Oval Office. And I think it was 79% of Americans support Ukraine. It's the highest level yet. Maybe it was 69%. I maybe got it wrong, but it was the highest level yet. So as always is a problem in American politics, what the people want doesn't always translate into policy. And that's, the thing we've got to struggle with. Let me mention this, and let's put the link in the chat. There's a bill that was introduced this week by a range of senators, bipartisan, from Lindsey Graham to Elizabeth Warren, 51 senators, saying that the U.S. should impose 500% secondary sanctions or tariffs on countries that buy oil, gas, and uranium from Russia. I mean, that would really be a move. And on the other side, Trump and his, business partner, what's his name? The guy that's, what's the guy, name of the guy, the real estate guy that's Trump's buddy that's doing the negotiating with Putin, Howard Lutnick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I got that right. I mean, he doesn't know the first thing about Ukraine or Russia, but they are trying to reopen business with Russia.
Absolutely.
So it'll be interesting to see how this sanctions bill, which has so much support, it cuts against Trump. Yeah. So that'll be something to watch.
Well, and that's, I think, the important thing for people to realize, and we certainly talked about this a lot in Europe, is that Donald Trump and Elon Musk are aligned with Vladimir Putin. This is a global neo-fascist connection, and that cannot be allowed to continue to stand. And it's frustrating to me to be hearing people who have spent their entire political careers in these anti-Russia, to the point where it's like Red Scare nonsense, now suddenly aligning behind a fascist dictator.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if you want to talk about your struggles in DSA with the International Committee. I've had the same struggles with the Green Party National Committee. And what I've been trying to tell them lately is, the facts have changed. I think it's an argument whether the U.S. ever intended to use Ukraine as a proxy against Russia. I mean, Obama said we're not sending them arms because that's in Putin's sphere of influence. And Trump was, he tried to extort dirt on Biden from Zelensky. Zelensky said no. So, Trump has been hostile. And then Biden was hesitant because he provided enough arms to stop the Russian advance, but not enough to push the Russians out, and had all these limitations and delays. So it's, I think, a spurious argument to say that, Ukraine is just a proxy for the U.S. against Russia. But even if you believe that, the facts have changed now. It's crystal clear that Trump is aligned with Putin. And so I've been telling people the facts have changed. Maybe it's time to change your opinion. So, but I'm having trouble. I don't know how to vote in DSA.
It's been a really difficult time to be, a leftist, a Ukrainian-American, someone who also believes in peace, who does not want endless war. One of the things that has and really became, even more clear to me after last week, is so many of the arguments are so black and white, and the peace argument, like, well, I don't support war. Well, neither do I. But allowing Russia to use aggression to take the sovereignty from another nation does not lead us to peace. It leads us to Russia invading Poland, Russia invading Moldova. So that argument of, like, I don't support war, me neither. But we don't get to peace by allowing what Vladimir Putin is doing to stand. The argument that the United States isn't doing this for altruistic reasons, I agree. The United States has never done anything for altruistic reasons. And that does not mean that in this moment, protecting the sovereignty of another nation is not the right thing to do. And connecting with so many people on the ground in Ukraine who are organizing and discussing a leftist reconstruction and building towards, more leftist working class solidarity in Ukraine, that doesn't happen under a Russian occupation of Ukraine. That doesn't happen if Ukraine does not exist. So if we want to see a leftist Ukraine, we have to stand in solidarity with Ukraine so that they exist to build that. The argument that I sometimes get that Ukraine has an oligarchical government, yes, they do. And the Ukrainian workers know that, and the Ukrainian people know that, and they don't want that, and they're actively organizing to fight against that. And if Ukraine doesn't exist, you better believe that Vladimir Putin isn't going to let the leftists come to power.
Or even organize.
Exactly.
If they organize, they'll end up in prison or worse.
Like Russians do when they end up, when they organize, and so the arguments that I have gotten have been so surface level without an understanding that there's so much gray area here. And there are real leftist people on the ground in Ukraine that also want a Ukraine that is free from Russia and free from United States imperialism. And I at this point in time, it's the United States and Russia dividing up what they have referred to as the assets of war. Those assets are sovereign land and a sovereign country and people who don't want to be under the imperialist occupation of either of these imperialist nations.
Yeah. One of the problems I have with people that say, well, I'm against war, so any arms the U.S. gives to Ukrainians to defend themselves is prolonging the war. And that fails to distinguish the moral difference between the aggressor, Russia, and the defenders, Ukraine. They're just defending their lives.
Yes.
And, how people can, not grasp that is a problem. And, what I hear from Ukrainian left is we got a three-front struggle: Russian tanks, Western banks, and Ukrainian oligarchs. They're clear about what their struggle is, but they know that under Russian occupation, they'll have to go underground. It'll be guerrilla warfare and secret organization and very, very difficult, as opposed to, at least in Ukraine, it's a flawed democracy, but it does allow people room to organize. And, I just want to, tell people what happened yesterday in Kryvyi Rih. There was a cluster bomb that from an Iskander ballistic missile, very fast missile, very hard to intercept. And it blew up above a playground in a residential area. And it killed so far 18 people, including 9 children, and injured 50, 30 of whom are still in hospital. This is just terrorism. There's no military target on a children's playground. But that's what Russia is doing. And, when people say I'm against the war, so don't give any arms to Ukraine, they got to make a moral distinction between terrorism and self-defense. So Chris Blankenhorn says nonviolence and peace include the right to self-defense, whether that is on the individual level or in geopolitics. Yeah, that actually is the formal position in the Green platform. But there's a group of people some of them are just pacifists who don't make that moral distinction between, aggression and self-defense, and others are pro-Russia. I mean, it's just where they're at.
The large scale consumption of Russian propaganda in the United States by both the left and the right at this point has been just horrific. The conversations around denazification and, oh, it's just Russian people. It's horrific. And are there Nazis in Ukraine? Probably. But guess what? There's Nazis in the United States too. And we as a country and a sovereign nation have the right to defend ourselves, as do the Ukrainians.
Well, in this country, they're in power.
They are in
power. He's endorsing the neo-Nazi party in Germany, the fascists in France, and giving Nazi salutes. So that really bugs me, because the far right in the last elections in Ukraine, the far right had a coalition, and they got, for the president, they got 1.56%. Their parliamentary list got 2.15%, I think. So they didn't even get into parliament. They're marginal. And people here are worrying about that without really knowing what's going on in Ukraine, while their own government's been taken over by the far right. It's just people got to get some perspective. But you're right about the propaganda, because people don't read it on RT and Sputnik mostly. They read it on so-called independent media that just reproduces. If you follow Gray Zone, if you follow RT and Sputnik and then Gray Zone, you'll see the day after RT and Sputnik say it, Gray Zone's got their angle on it. It's and they're just one example. So it's very influential, unfortunately, on the left in the case of Gray Zone, as well as the other thing is, the far right reproduces all this. I mean, you get it right out of the mouths of people like Trump and Vance and the negotiators. I'm trying to remember that guy's name. Repeating stuff like, Russia should keep the lands they partially occupied because they had referendums. Of course, there were referendums at gunpoint. It's atrocious.
No, it's absolutely atrocious, and it cannot be allowed that a country can be carved up and then the aggressor gets to keep that. That is not a path towards global peace. That is not a path towards justice, morality, and what is right. And you're absolutely right. Like, it is, our government has been taken over by the Nazis, and we need to fight back. This is one of the things, as we were talking when I was in Europe, that came up, is we need to stand in solidarity with Ukraine as the American people. We need to stand in solidarity with Europe as the people. This net notion of international working class solidarity, but we need help. Like, the United States is not okay. Like, we are going to need that solidarity. We need to take our government back. That was a big part of the protests today in the United States. Hands off our government, hands off our democracy. This is not okay. But it's also, it's I'm glad to see people waking up. And this has been going on for a long time. This did not just happen on election day in 2024. We've been moving in this direction for a long time.
Well, why don't we take questions and comments from the chat now? So we get some of what you people have been talking about in the chat. And Chris, who's behind the curtain, he's got a baby and a toddler, so maybe he's preoccupied, but I see the list he's starred. And let me pick one of these. Okay, Joanna Munley asks, any thoughts on the rallies Bernie Sanders is having around the country currently? I'm wondering if he might run for president again.
So I cannot speak to, Senator Sanders and I have a working professional relationship, and yes, he does endorse, my campaigns and policy. We've certainly discussed policy, but I can't speak to his future plans. I do think, he's 83 years old. He also has, the right to rest and retirement should he choose that. The rallies around the country, he has many times in the last, 8 years been the most popular politician in the United States, and that is true again. because he is speaking to the real issues that are facing people. You know, one of the things that has been important in all of my conversations, whether in Vermont or somewhere in the United States or in Europe or in the UK, is the far right. There are very real Nazis that have weaponized despair towards hatred and division. We need instead to offer solidarity and unity. And I love that Bernie and AOC are bringing people together. And I think that that is critically important. I think the next question I have, though, is then what? So we all come together and we protest and we rally, but like, what are we organizing? What foundation are we building so that, you know, to your point, Howie, there is an ability to have like an actual networked left movement to do something different. And so I can't speak to whether or not Bernie's going to run for president again. I can't speak to what the ultimate goal is, but what I want to see from these rallies, they're huge. That people are coming out saying, yes, we want that. I want to see a really connected, organized plan to give the people what they want and need.
So let's see, another question. Vicky Corden, the fact that Trump wants Canada, Greenland, and Panama Canal shows he is like Putin. Putin occupying Ukraine, so Trump could do the same.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think it, like, it's wild to me that it is not crystal clear to every single American, every single person around the globe that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are operating from the same playbook. This is their global agenda. This is something I found myself saying over and over and over again in every one of my speeches, whether it was at UK Parliament, whether it was at the Solidarity Summit, whether it was just in informal conversation. This Putin-Musk-Trump agenda is an agenda for global fascism.
Yeah, and an authoritarian international order. It's like George Orwell's 1984.
Yes.
You know, you got Oceania, which is, you know, the US and Western Europe, although that is kind of divided now. Eurasia, which is Russia, and East Asia, which is China. And, you know, they're three superpowers, and they have endless wars where, you know, they keep changing alliances, usually East Asia in 1984. And that seems to be the world we're going into. And Trump and Putin, say, yeah, that's what we want. So the question of Greenland, I mean, Putin was asked that, and he basically said, well, that's not our affair. That's in the American sphere of influence, basically saying they can have it, and implicitly saying, so we should have Ukraine. And that's a very different world where might makes right compared to what was tried to be set up after World War II of the UN and international law and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And these authoritarians want to throw all that out. And that's a recipe for war. And it's something that, you know, just speaking to the Green Party, we say, we give lip service to the idea that we need a foreign policy that is pro-democracy and international law and human rights. But when it comes to Ukraine, you know, the Green Party as a whole, it's divided, but as a whole, just can't seem to get behind international law. I mean, Russia is an aggressor, and as the Nuremberg trial said, that's the supreme war crime. All the others derive from it. So,
absolutely. I mean, the fear from people that I was speaking to in Europe and select people in the United States, that we are on the precipice of World War III is palpable.
Yeah, and since we're bringing up Trump's potential aggression, I just want to remind people that right now with U.S. weapons, Israel is pummeling Gaza in a genocidal attack. And they have placed half a dozen B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Usually when B-2s are used on bombing runs to the Middle East. They leave from Missouri and they fly back to Missouri. The fact that they positioned 6 in Diego Garcia, which makes it much closer to Iran, when Netanyahu's been egging on Trump to join him in attacking Iran. I mean, to me, the question is whether Trump's going to decide to take Greenland because it would be easy and a victory, and then he could go after Iran, or whether he's going to go after Iran, right now while all this chaos is going on in the Middle East. I mean, the idea from some, including on the naive left, that Russia is not aggressive is it's just not dealing with the realities. And now, as you say, Trump and Putin are aligned on Ukraine and on a new world order based on might makes right. It's a really dangerous situation. I would say, I was very involved in the anti-nuclear weapons movement in the 80s when we had the Euro missiles crisis, and Russia put intermediate range nuclear missiles in what is now Belarus, pointed at Europe in the late 70s. And then when the US responded with Pershing II intermediate range missiles in Germany, the anti-nuclear weapons movement exploded. And at the end of that, we did get the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty signed between Gorbachev and Reagan. So, I guess take hope from that, but we've got to build the movement.
Yes, we do. And it has to be an international movement. It has to be a movement where we stand in solidarity with working people everywhere, including Ukraine, including, of course, Palestine. We can say whatever we want, like it or not like it, about globalism but we live in a globalized world. This rise to this new world order is happening globally. We have to combat it globally, and we have to combat it with solidarity, not fear and hatred.
Justice Fee, was there any mention of joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons at the conference?
Not that I heard, but I wasn't in every space. There were simultaneous, at points, there were 3 different workshops running at the same time, or 3 different conversations running at the same time. And as I said, for more than half of one of the days, I was at EU Parliament. So it is possible that it came up, and it simply did not come up in one of the spaces I was in.
Vicky Corden, it seems that Trump and Musk want to export Project 2025 and Christian nationalism globally. Very infuriating. There will be no safe space or safe place.
So I think, yes, as we've been talking about, this is a global movement, but this didn't start with Trump and Musk and Project 2025. Putin has actually been infiltrating these Christo-fascist, Christian authoritarian, Christian nationalist churches to spread this message and build this. This is the exact type of connectiveness I'm talking about. Yes, that is exactly what they want to do. They want global Project 2025.
And particularly the Christian nationalism, the so quote unquote traditional values, which means anti-women, anti-LGBTQ, and actually another scapegoat are environmentalists. Climate change is a hoax. Putin said that for a long time until the climate conferences got, pretty clear that there was a problem. And then he said, yeah, there's a problem, but it's, Russia has made no action. It's a petrostate. And now he wants to get together with Trump to bring back, Chevron and Exxon into the Russian energy sector. That's a climate bomb. All those, gas and oil and coal fields in Russia, they should stay in the ground. We should be helping Russia go renewable, helping ourselves go renewable. Instead, we're going, that's a bomb that won't blow up all at once like nukes, but is going to put us in a terrible situation. I mean, the statistics coming out on climate change, there was one this week that I'm trying to remember that kind of shocked me. And even though I follow this, I forget what it was, but we're in big trouble.
Yes, we are.
Scout Trooper 164. Do you have any views to some saying the decline in the economy and stock market are the beginning of the end for MAGA?
I don't know that it's that simple. I think it's part of why people are waking up, and people, I think it's a part of why there were so many people out today. But I don't think that it by itself is the end. That this destroying the economy and making people more desperate, I think, could create space to further weaponize that despair into more hatred and more division. And, we certainly know that Hitler's Germany arose because of, for many reasons, but economic despair was one part of it. And so could this be something that moves us in the direction of ending the end of MAGA? I guess, but not on its own. People are gonna have to stay in the streets, and people are it's going to take us fighting to take our government back. I don't think that the destruction of the stock market and the economy on its own are going to be the end.
Yeah, and I think the game plan for Trump, like it was for Hitler, is the scapegoat.
Yeah.
So no matter how bad the economy goes, Trump and people like him are going to be blaming immigrants, uppity women, people of color. DEI is a drag on the economy. They will find scapegoats. So it's really a battle for people's minds.
Yeah.
Are they going to understand that Trump tanked the economy, or are they going to, believe Trump that it was these scapegoats that he'll identify? That's going to be not just being on the streets, but, educating people in every venue. And I just want to note that the craven surrender of Ivy League institutions, starting with Columbia and now Penn and Brown and Harvard and Yale, is a bad indication. I mean, these are some of the most privileged, secure people in the world, and they are cowering before Trump because they're going to lose some contracts, and even though they got huge endowments, that money means more to them than academic freedom and standing up to this bully. It's so don't rely on the privileged liberals in these institutions. It's going to have to be regular people in our own organizations.
I mean, this is something that I've said here. This is something that I said, when I was in Europe. It certainly got, some looks, but we are going to have to fight to save each other. The rainbow oligarchs are not going to save us. And this is these privileged liberals, like the people who are benefiting from the system as it is now, but socially don't think that we should, execute people who don't live their lives the way we do. They are not coming to save us economically because they are benefiting from this system. I mean, this is the sort of like nice neoliberal politics, right? Like, oh, well, what if we just find a compromise? We are fighting for our lives. There is no compromise. And this is sort of where it brings me back to Ukraine. If Russia leaves Ukraine, the war is over. If Ukraine stops fighting, there's no more Ukraine. There is no compromise. Russia needs to leave. That is the path out. We don't compromise with terrorists. We don't compromise when the compromise is, well, maybe we just let some of these people die. But that has always been, well, maybe not always, but in my lifetime, this sort of neoliberal compromise. Well, maybe we just make some people homeless. Well, maybe we just make some people not be able to put food on their tables. No, we have to fight for all of us.
Yeah, and I think that's the question we got to pose to people if we still want to say they're on the left that are not in solidarity with Ukraine. You really want this war to stop? You're right. Russia has to go home. So even right now, Trump is having these performative con job negotiations where all the pressure is put on Ukraine to surrender land and now their resources, and nothing's being put on Russia. And so what should we be demanding? One thing might be this bill that just got introduced in the Senate this week. How about we defend the funding of the Yale program that was documenting these abducted children. There are a lot of things we can do. And also, a lot of that stuff's hard to win, but we can always do material aid.
Yes.
And I know, Tanya, you're involved in an effort that hopefully will, with the Ukraine Solidarity Network, lead to material aid program for Be Like Nina, which is the nurses union in Ukraine, to bring medical supplies. And Ukraine Solidarity Network has already done a program for generators that we gave to the miners and railway workers unions, because those generators are needed, of course, during the winter when they don't have power, but also in the summer, like refrigeration to preserve food.
Not just refrigeration. Last summer, there was a historic heat wave through all of Eastern Europe for more than 6 weeks. It was not below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Like, we're talking 40, 50 C for day after day after day. Like, climate change is here. There is material aid, and I can certainly, send on some other ways to connect. Right here in Vermont, there's a group that is working to try and pull together surplus electrical supplies to get to Ukraine. And I think we need to be connecting with our unions here. Yeah, there's a fight on the ground here, but how can we come together and work with labor? I was told this beautiful story when I was in the UK after I spoke, and we were, all out at the pub, and someone came up to me and they gave me this beautiful pin from the UK Miners Union. And during the 1980s, when the UK Miners Union was on strike, it was the Ukrainian Miners Union that helped make sure they had food. Like, we have to be doing this work together, and connecting our IBEW here with the electrical union in Ukraine and our teachers and then, of course, there is individual material aid. I look at the funding for that work at Yale, and there are plenty of individual Americans that could cough up the funding for that study. Why aren't they?
Yeah, and where are some of these liberal philanthropists? That's a good question that I wish I had an answer to, or knew who to contact at Yale to see if they're actually trying to replace the government contract with, private donations, because that, Yale had the capacity to scour through public notices in Russia, social media, and identify these children that way, that the Ukrainian government had documented about a little over 19,000. The Yale project got it up to 35,000. And, the damn Russians, I think he's head of the parliament, or their Duma, they call it, said, we've got 700,000 Ukrainian children. Now, some of them are in families that went to Russia when the war started, forced or not. That may be true, but there's just a lot of children that have been separated from their families, just like, Trump was separating immigrants from their families here. And it's something that, has to be documented, and those children brought back to their families in Ukraine.
When you are kidnapping children and sending them to re-education camps to torture them away from their culture, heritage, and identity, you are involved in a genocide. And I think we need to say it. The Russia will only be happy and satisfied when Ukraine is wiped off the map. And then they won't be satisfied either, because they will be coming for the next place that they want.
Vicki Corden, any thoughts about several professors leaving the country, especially the ones who talked about fascism?
I can understand the inclination to want to leave. It is not safe here. And I certainly am here, speaking up, fighting back. And I know that the day may come where it is not safe. And that has to be a personal choice. I think it can be easy to be angry that people left and didn't stay and fight. My grandmother left Hungary in 1956 when she was 15 years old, and has an understanding of what it looks like, when fascist governments come to power, or occupying governments try to quell a revolution. That each individual's personal safety and personal risk assessment and tolerance of risk is theirs. But I think that the fact that we are seeing academics who are speaking out about fascism making the decision that it's no longer safe to be here should be a huge, glowing, flashing in our face red flag as to where we are going. We know how this story ends if we don't fight to take our government back.
One of those professors, Jason Stanley, who's written about fascism, was teaching at Yale. He's from Syracuse, so it's been written up in our newspapers. And he said, look, he comes from a Jewish family that got out just in time from the Nazis, so he's here. And his wife is an African, so their children are both Black and Jewish. And they don't feel they can bring those children up without a lot of stress in the United States anymore.
Exactly.
So he had an offer at York University in Toronto, and he took it. And also going there, probably the most famous person is Timothy Snyder, who people probably heard of. He's written a lot of histories on Eastern Europe, and his wife Marcy Shore. So those are very prominent people that have studied fascism, and as you say, that should be a huge, siren warning to all of us that this is really bad what we're in.
Yes.
And if you don't get it yet, that ought to get your attention. Okay, well, Tanya, we've used up our hour. I really appreciate you coming on. And if people didn't get enough of Tanya, she'll be speaking to the Ukraine Solidarity Network membership meeting tomorrow. It's 4:30. And if you're in the Ukraine Solidarity Network and getting the notices, you know about that. If not, go to the Ukraine Solidarity Network webpage and sign the mission statement and get involved, and send an email if you don't get an email about the listserv where we notify these meetings. So you can hear more from Tanya tomorrow. I know I will. Any last things you want to say, Tanya, before we go?
I want to thank you for having me and having this conversation and being willing to sort of stand firm for what is right, even in these really tough spaces. The place we're in is dark, but I do truly believe that we can win the fight that we are in for our lives, our future, our planet, and our people. And so as dark as it is, I hope people find the ways to take care of themselves and stay connected so that we can keep fighting forward, because we have to.
Well, thanks for coming on, Tanya. And, we'll be in touch about material aid and other things. So next week, I will be in Papua New Guinea. And for the podcast, it's going to be recorded because 3 p.m. in the East Coast of the U.S. is 3 a.m. in Papua New Guinea. So I'm not going to get my guest up at 3 a.m. in the morning, but we're going to record it beforehand. And my guest will be Benny Wenda, who is the interim president of the Provisional Government of West Papua. He's the leader of the West Papua United Liberation Movement. And if you don't know about West Papua, it's probably it may be the most brutal occupation, just in terms of the cruelty that the Indonesians impose on the Papuans as they steal their land resources. And this colonization has been going on since the 1960s. When the Dutch left, West Papua wanted independence and Indonesia took it over, and the international community has pretty much looked the other way. So that's what we'll be talking about next Saturday. And the following 2 Saturdays, I'll probably have another recorded podcast with some people in Papua New Guinea about their struggles and the Green Party there, which is really the only modern party that has a program and runs women and other things. And then I'll be in Australia. And I think my guest will be a former, federal senator in Australia who just retired, named Janet Rice, or maybe somebody else. But she just hasn't given me a time. She said she's going to do it. We just got to nail down the time because they're very busy. They have May 3rd elections. And as you know, they've elected, they've had proportional representation in their Senate. So they have 10 to 12% of the senators, which is their vote, in those. It's proportional ranked choice voting in their Senate. In their House, it's single member district ranked choice voting, which is still tough. But they've now got 4 members of their House, and they're going for more. So I will be reporting on that the third Saturday going forward. And then I'll be back here when we get into May, and I'll be live and can take your questions and answers. So that's what's ahead. And thanks again, Tanya. And I hope everybody has a good week, and you're out there, resisting what's going on in this country. So take care, everybody.